All right, so we're going to move on and start talking about the circulatory system and how our circulatory system helps us to maintain homeostasis. Circulatory system obviously is really important. Um, what's the function of our circulatory system? If something interferes with it in a significant way, we can't survive. So, what is it actually doing? But why? Darren, you're right. It does keep us alive. Like, what's so important about it? Yeah, and that's really the important. They're all important, but the most important thing is that oxygen. Circulatory system transports the oxygen that we inhale all over our body. As we talked about, every single cell in your body must have oxygen for cellular respiration to release energy, because energy is what keeps us alive. And so if something breaks down and we're not able to get that oxygen to our cells, they can't survive. It does other things. It delivers nutrients and glucose. It removes waste products like carbon dioxide. So it does lots of different things, but they're all related to transport. It transports material through our body. Humans have what we call a closed circulatory system. All of our blood, if everything's working properly, is contained within our blood vessels and our heart. Some animals don't. They have what's called an open circulatory system, like insects, for example. Basically, their blood is not held in vessels. It just is like surrounding all of their body tissue. Our closed circulatory system is a 4-chambered heart, and that has certain advantages. Not all animals have that. Fish have 2-chambered hearts. Amphibians, reptiles have 3-chambered hearts. Birds and mammals have 4-chambered hearts. And there are advantages to that we'll talk about. So our circulatory system consists of our heart and then the blood vessels that carry the blood and the blood itself. And we have veins, capillaries, and arteries are the 3 types of blood vessels. We have about 4 to 6 liters of blood in our body. So a gallon and a half of blood in our bodies circulating around. And our blood is considered a tissue, a group of cells working together. It has in it several parts that we'll talk about, but it's the red blood cells and this molecule in them called hemoglobin that is actually able to bind to oxygen in our lungs and deliver it to our cells. So if you think about function of the circulatory system, it's to distribute those nutrients. Also, it's responsible for fighting off infection and disease and pathogens. It clots when we have damage to a blood vessel. It also, as we just learned, helps distribute heat around our body. So this is a diagram of, part of the circulatory system. The arteries are in red, veins are in blue. And this is a picture of the heart, what it would actually look like. This is a heart as well. This is a band called Heart. Think about our blood. Although we might just think blood is like this red liquid, it actually has different parts to it. There's the plasma. That's the liquid part of the blood. If you separate the parts out, you can actually see it. There's a process that's called a centrifuge, which you put a tube of liquid in it. It spins it around super fast, and the parts separate out. So you can centrifuge blood, and if you did, you'd see it would look like this. The plasma is the least dense. It would be on top. It's like this yellowish kind of liquid. And then there's the cells, which are at the bottom here. And of those cells, most of them are red blood cells. Okay? But there's some white blood cells and also some platelets as well. And our blood plasma is mostly water with some other stuff dissolved in there. So the plasma is that liquid part of the blood. It's more than half of the blood. And most of that is water. Here in this diagram at the right, this is plasma. So when, I don't know, if you ever donate blood when you get to be 18, they give you a needle into a vein, and they take some blood, basically bleed into a bag, and they could separate that out. They could separate the plasma from the red blood cells. You could also just donate plasma itself. They have special machines that help you to do that. And here's blood when it's been centrifuged. You could see the plasma is that clearish yellow liquid on top, and then you can see the really dark part on the bottom. Those are the red blood cells and the other parts. And so the plasma really is it's like a river, and the cells are kind of floating along in it. It carries the other components of the blood. It also is where the carbon dioxide that our blood carries, that's dissolved typically in the plasma of our blood. As we inhale and exhale, carbon dioxide that's carried in our plasma makes our blood slightly acidic. So as we just talked about in our last activity, our brain can sense that. Our brain senses the pH of our blood and can tell us how much we need to breathe. And that's what increases our breathing rate or decreases our breathing rate. The red blood cells in our body, their job is to carry oxygen and a little bit of carbon dioxide. Red blood cells look kind of like frisbees, plates, bagels without a hole. They have a specific kind of distinct shape, a flattened disc. And they have in them, they actually are cells without a nucleus. So red blood cells in humans have no nucleus in them. What they do have is a molecule called hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is really important. It's a protein that has iron in it. And this is what can grab onto the oxygen. Here you can see red blood cells in a packet for giving somebody a blood transfusion. A tiny little milliliter of blood contains 5 million red blood cells. We have billions and billions of red blood cells circulating throughout our body. Once they're kind of used up and no longer working effectively, they're destroyed in our spleen, and new ones are created. We're always producing new red blood cells, and that happens in the bone marrow. Like in our long bones, inside the center of them is the bone marrow. That's where these blood cells are actually produced and created. Platelets are the part of our blood that seals up any damage that we might have to blood vessels. They're not really cells. They're fragments of cells and proteins. They're really small. And so here what you see in this sort of diagram, there's been damage to an artery or a vein or something. If you get a cut. And what happens is these white things are the platelets. And they're attracted to that opening. And they basically start to clump together, forming a blood clot to seal that up so that a person doesn't continue bleeding. They form blood clots. Now, are blood clots good or bad? On what?
Like if it's clotting to stop a cut or clotting for to stop a vein.
Yeah, exactly. So blood clots are good when they're sealing up a cut that you might have. That's their function. But if a blood clot forms when it shouldn't, if a blood clot forms in an artery or a vein It can circulate around a person's body, and if it gets like lodged in to a capillary somewhere, it can block the flow of blood. So like if that blood clot somehow made its way into the brain and stopped the flow of blood to a part of the brain, it could result in a stroke. If that blood clot made its way into the coronary artery, it can lead to a heart attack. So blood clots forming when they shouldn't can be dangerous. There's certain medications a doctor can give people that stops their blood from clotting as easily. So if a person is forming blood clots, that could be dangerous. So certain medicines can reduce that. But if you're on one of those medicines, you have to be careful. Because your blood is not clotting, because the medicine is lowering the ability of your blood to clot, if you get a cut or something, it will bleed more than normal. Okay? You might get bruises really easily because a bruise is just bleeding under the skin. There are certain diseases in which a person's blood doesn't clot at all. It's called hemophilia. You may have learned about it in like European history because hemophilia is a genetic disease that affected the royal lineages in Europe because there was a lot of intermarrying between close relatives to sort of keep the lines of the monarchy sort of pure. And that can lead to mutations starting to pop up. And that's what happened, is that children started to be born with hemophilia. And at that time, it could be a fatal disease because an injury could lead to heavy bleeding. And so some families tried to keep this a secret because then if people knew, other royal families of other countries knew hemophilia was in this family, they wouldn't want their families to marry. And so sometimes it was like hidden. If you ever watch like is it The Crown? Yeah, in The Crown this comes up. If you ever watch that series on Netflix, hemophilia comes up. Oh, I didn't do attendance. Jeez. I gotta apologize. Hello? Hello? I will. Thanks for chatting. All right. So clotting is good when it should happen to help us heal, and it can be bad when clots form for unknown reasons. And so a blood clot really is what's a scab on the outside of your body. That's basically platelets that have clumped up some damage to your body along with trapped red blood cells and white blood cells and so forth. And then we have the white blood cells. What's the purpose of white blood cells in our body? What do they do? Jordan? Yeah, they're our immune system. Our white blood cells are part of our immune system. Our immune system is really complex. There's all different types of cells and different jobs that they need to do. They do have a nucleus, unlike the red blood cells, but there's different types of white blood cells. Some of them, their job is to engulf and destroy pathogens. Some of them create antibodies to help us, help our bodies remember what a pathogen looks like so that we can defend against it in the future. There's fewer of them than the red blood cells, many fewer. And they're typically, about the size of red blood cells, sometimes much larger. And they sort of ramp up in production when we are sick. So one of the things, like if a person was not feeling well, they may go to the doctor, and the doctor may order what's called a CBC, a complete blood count. They basically take a sample of blood and they count how many red blood cells and white blood cells and platelets there are. And if they find that there's an elevated number of white blood cells, that might be a sign that somewhere in that person's body they have an infection. Because that's what happens. When we have an infection, our white blood cell production ramps up to help defend us, to help destroy those pathogens to keep us healthy. Here you can see this is a white blood cell that is in the process of engulfing some bacteria. Okay, the yellow is the white blood cell. Those orange things, those are the bacteria cells. And here you see another type of white blood cell, again, attacking those bacteria. So if we think about, the heart is the main pump of the circulatory system. Here's the model of the heart. That's it. It's a little large. I don't know. I feel like that model is a little bit too big.
Isn't it about the size of your fist?
Yeah, it's about the size of your fist typically. And the heart is basically an organ that's made of muscle and nervous tissue. And the way that our heart works is its sort of circulation is kind of split in two sides. And the right side of our heart receives blood from all the various parts of our body, from our brain and our legs and our arms. All of that blood is funneled into the heart on the right side. Where do you think that blood needs to go? If it just came from your brain and your legs and your arms, do you think that blood is high in oxygen or low in oxygen? If it just came from your brain and your legs and your arms, it's low. It just delivered oxygen, right, to all the parts of your body. So when it comes back in the heart, it's low in oxygen. So where do you think it needs to go? The lungs. It needs to go to the lungs because that's where it's going to kind of get recharged. So then the right side of your heart takes that deoxygenated blood and pumps it to your lungs. As that blood goes through your lungs, as we talked about, it goes near the alveoli that you're inhaling and exhaling, and oxygen from the air you inhaled can then go into your blood, and now it's oxygenated. That blood from our lungs goes back to the heart, but this time it goes to the opposite side. It goes to the left side of the heart. Goes into the heart, and then it gets pumped back out to all the parts of the body so that it can deliver that oxygen to all of our body parts. Hello? Good, how are you? Okay. All right, thank you. So, the two sides of our heart handle sort of different types of blood. The right side handles the deoxygenated blood, sends it to the lungs. The left side handles oxygenated blood and sends it off to all the parts of the body. The heart itself needs oxygen. It's a muscle, and muscles use a lot of energy. So around the outside of the heart, what you see is there's these coronary arteries. They're actually bringing blood to the heart itself. Even though the heart's kind of filled with blood most of the time, it doesn't absorb it through the inside of the heart. It needs its own blood vessels supplying the muscle. Those are really important. If they were to get blocked, it could cause a heart attack. We'll talk more about that after. So in a little while, we're going to talk about blood pressure and measure our own blood pressure. Our blood pressure is when our heart pumps, it squeezes blood into our arteries, and that exerts pressure on the arteries. And measuring that pressure is what we measure when someone takes our blood pressure. So does anyone know last time you went to the doctor what your blood pressure was? When they tell it to you, like, what is the format? Yeah, it's like a phrase, like 110 over 70, something like that. Those two numbers mean two different things. The larger number is the pressure on your arteries when your heart is contracting. Okay, your heart's squeezing blood into your arteries, so the pressure rises. The second, lower number, is when your heart relaxes. There's still pressure, but it's much lower. And those are the two numbers. Called systole, okay, is when it's contracting. Diastole is when it's not. And it's measured using a device sometimes called a sphygmomanometer, and that's, blood pressure cuff. We also know that the beating of our heart, the rhythm of our heart, is important. Our heart rhythm can change, and the pace of it changes depending on our activity level. So our activity level rises, our heart beats faster. Our cells need more oxygen. They're producing more waste, so our heart rate accelerates. When we're resting, we're sleeping, our heart rate drops down. Our cells aren't using that much energy, so they need less of a supply of blood. There's special cells in the heart that tell it when to contract. Okay? And they kind of send this electrical signal telling the chambers of the heart when to contract. And that has to be coordinated pretty well in order for our heart to work efficiently. Sometimes it doesn't work well. Sometimes the heart gets out of rhythm. Okay? And how does a doctor or somebody get it back into rhythm? Yeah, with an electrical shock. So you may know around our school, for example, there's AEDs, automatic external defibrillators. And those work, basically, you don't have to know anything much to use them. If you ever had to use a defibrillator, like coaches are all trained how to use them. You take the thing out, you put two sticky pads on a person's chest and abdomen. The machine actually monitors the heart rhythm, and it knows whether or not the person should get a shock. If they don't need it, it won't give them one. If it does need it, it actually talks, it tells you. So press the button, you press it, it runs an electrical current from one pad to the other, and that kind of can reset the rhythm of the heart and get it back into a normal rhythm. And you've seen in shows like an EKG is a graph that's showing the electrical activity in a person's heart, and it shows how that activity is happening. And there's certain patterns that are a sign that it's not working properly. When we look at the structure of the heart, we see the right side of the heart. We color in blue to represent deoxygenated blood, even though actually deoxygenated blood is not blue. Even if somebody told you that, it's not true. It does change color slightly. It's like darker red or maybe purple when it doesn't have oxygen, but really it's not blue. But we typically use blue when we're trying to signify deoxygenated blood. So here's the right side of the heart. It collects blood from the bottom of the person. If this is my heart, why does this say right side? Is it wrong?
No.
Why is it right? Yeah, but what's Madison?
Because on the first is the right side of the heart.
Yeah, whenever you talk about anatomy, like which of my arms is this? My right. Even though when you look at me, it's on the left, it's my right arm. If this is my heart, this is the right side of my heart. even though when you're looking at me like this, it's on the left as you look at me. That's why in anatomy, things are kind of reversed. So this is the right side of the heart. The blood from like your abdomen, your legs comes up this way. Blood from your arms and your head come in this way. Again, that blood is deoxygenated. It's already given up all of its oxygen to different parts of your body. So it gets pumped in from the atrium, the entryway, into a ventricle, which is going to squeeze it out. And where's this blood headed? Where's it going? Somebody just said it, I heard it. Lungs. Needs to get recharged. Goes to your lungs. You breathe in. It gets filled back up with oxygen. It gets rid of carbon dioxide, comes back into the heart again. But this time, where is it going? It's coming in this side. It's coming in here. It's going into the left side, left ventricle. Where's this blood going now that it has oxygen? Everywhere, throughout your body. This is the aorta. It's the largest blood vessel in your entire body. And it has branches. One branch will eventually lead down your left arm. Two go up to your brain. One goes down to your right arm. Then it loops around. It goes behind your heart. It goes to your legs and your abdomen, bringing the blood all throughout your entire body. And then it heads back to the heart eventually. The types of blood vessels are arteries, veins, and capillaries. Arteries are thick, strong, elastic blood vessels. They have to withstand the pressure of our blood as our heart beats. They bring the blood away from the heart. A artery away. Most of that is oxygenated blood. Most of the arteries carrying blood out of our heart are oxygenated blood, but there is that one exception, the pulmonary artery, because that's the one that brings the blood to the lungs. You know what the word pulmonary means? Do you know what CPR stands for? Cardio, pulmonary, resuscitation. What does cardio mean? Heart. Cardio means heart. So if you think about CPR, when a person does chest compressions, that's the cardio part. A person's like compressing a person's heart, forcing the blood out of it. What about the pulmonary then? What's the other part of CPR besides chest compressions? Rescue breathing. Exhaling air into a person's respiratory system. That's the pulmonary part. Pulmonary means lungs. And resuscitation means to revive almost. It's to try to bring somebody back to consciousness through artificially compressing their heart and breathing air into their lungs. Typically, arteries are deeper in our body. If you look at the back of your hand and you could see blood vessels, I have pretty veiny hands. Those are typically veins at the surface. Arteries are a little bit deeper usually to be protected. Because if a person gets damage to an artery, there's high pressure in the arteries. That's when you see in a movie, somebody gets cut and blood spurts out. That's an artery that got cut because there's high pressure in arteries. If you feel your pulse, if you remember we did the Making Connections lab, we had to measure our pulse. You're touching an artery because every time your heart beats, these arteries expand. So when you can feel it somewhere in your neck and your wrist, you're feeling an artery and it's expanding. If arteries get clogged up with gunk, fat, plaques due to a poor diet, that narrows the artery and it restricts the flow of blood. Here we see some of the arteries, and here we see the arteries of the entire body. Veins are the blood vessels that carry the blood back to the heart. So arteries carry the blood away, veins carry the blood to the heart. Most of them carry deoxygenated blood, but there are some exceptions. The pulmonary vein is the vein that carries the blood from the lungs back to the heart. These are often closer to the surface of our body. Often we can see them. If you have to get an IV or if you're donating blood, they're putting the needle into a vein, not an artery. Now, because there's lower pressure in the veins, they have these valves that are like one-way doors so that the blood can only go in one direction. Okay, so that it doesn't go in reverse. Sometimes those valves break down, especially as a person gets older. Have you ever heard of varicose veins? Like when a person has like on their legs, they often form like swollen, bulging veins that you can see. Those are called varicose veins. And what's happened is the valves have malfunctioned and blood is kind of pooling in those areas. They're not as elastic. They're thinner because they don't have to withstand very high pressure. The last type of blood vessel is the capillary. Capillaries connect arteries and veins. And so it carries both oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. And basically anywhere in our body where we have cells, we also have capillaries. They're very, very tiny. They are embedded and surround all of our tissues. They're very, very thin. They are just a single cell thick. Because what happens in these capillaries is they need to allow materials to move into and out of the blood. For example, our brain is surrounded by this network of capillaries. So when blood gets to these capillaries, oxygen from our blood can diffuse into the cells of our brain, giving them oxygen. At the same time, carbon dioxide that's being produced in our brain can diffuse into the blood through these very, very thin, tiny capillaries. Sometimes if they get damaged, that can lead to bruising. Like if you smack your arm on a desk, you could rupture some of these capillaries, and then you have some bleeding under your skin. And that's what a bruise is. You can see that blood underneath the skin. So these capillaries are really important because this is where materials are moving in and out of our cells. What we see here, this is the oxygenated blood. It's coming to part of our body. These are the capillaries. They're so narrow, only a single cell at a time can go through. They have to go single file. And in these capillaries is where materials move back and forth. Oxygen goes from our blood into the body cells. Waste from our cells goes into our blood so it can be disposed of. We'll finish up, talk about some diseases of the circulatory system. One is hypertension. That's another term for high blood pressure. Girls, can you listen? High blood pressure is the most common type of cardiovascular disease. Typically affects people when they're older, but young people can have high blood pressure. And high blood pressure is dangerous because it can damage the arteries. If the pressure the blood is putting in arteries is too high, it can damage them. It could damage the heart muscle. Different things cause high blood pressure. Stress. When a person is stressed, when their blood pressure rises. A poor diet's high in salt, can cause our blood pressure to increase. Smoking, drinking alcohol, those things can increase blood pressure as well. And also our blood pressure can increase as we get older. So that's hypertension. Now, if you have high blood pressure, it's very, very common. There's lots of different medications a person takes to help bring down their blood pressure. Or sometimes people try to manage it with their diet or by exercising. Exercising can help reduce our blood pressure. Another cardiovascular disease is atherosclerosis. That's hardening of the arteries due to the buildup of plaques in our arteries. So as we eat fats and cholesterol and trans fats, sometimes those fats can collect on the inside of our arteries and they can narrow and harden the arteries. So blood flowing through there is not flowing effectively. A heart attack is when those blood vessels that are feeding the heart, they might be clogged. They might have plaques in them. And that means blood might not be getting to the heart effectively. And that's dangerous. If our heart doesn't have a good supply of blood, it stops working. And then the rest of our body is not going to get enough blood. Do you know the I'll wait for it in a second. Anemia is when our blood's not carrying enough oxygen. It could be caused by not enough iron in the diet or for other reasons. Leukemia is a type of cancer in our bone marrow that leads to the production of white blood cells, the overproduction of white blood cells. So here's some pictures just showing these different things. Here in this diagram, top left, we see a narrowed artery in the heart, a narrowed coronary artery. And if it gets blocked completely, that's very dangerous. If part of the heart muscle is not receiving enough blood, it starts to die. You can see that here. Sometimes they can do, they inject a dye into a person's arteries to try to visualize, and that's what this is. This is a coronary angiogram where they're looking at the coronary artery that supplies the heart with blood. And they can tell in this case if there's blockages. And here again, we could see some of that atherosclerotic artery, that plaque that's built up inside of these blood vessels. So if a person does have coronary heart disease, the blood vessels feeding their heart are clogged, what are the treatments? Yeah, one is they can have a stent put in. Do you know what a stent is? Sort of. It is a little piece of metal mesh. So here's how a stent works. Typically, they're put in in coronary catheterization. They basically insert a wire into an artery, and they feed the wire up into the heart, into the coronary artery. You can see the wire here. And they get this wire to where the blockage is, like you see here. Here you have plaque built up. This artery is very narrow. Not much blood is getting through it. And what they do is they can inflate a little balloon. You can see it here at the end of this wire. And that kind of opens up the artery. And then they could put this little metal mesh in. That's what a stent is. And that helps to reinforce the artery so it remains open. And they're medicated so more plaque doesn't build up on it. And oftentimes they can open up a clogged artery in this way. But sometimes they can't. If they can't open it up with a stent, do you know the next step that they might take for a person with severe blockage in their coronary arteries? They might do a bypass surgery, coronary bypass. Coronary bypass is interesting. Here we see there's a blockage in these two coronary arteries. Blood's not getting to these parts of the heart. What doctors can actually do is they could take a vein from another part of a person's body, typically from their leg, cut it out, go into their heart and actually sort of paste it in. You see, this is the vein that they've kind of connected. So if there's a blockage here, blood now can go through the aorta. Some of it's going to come here and go past the blockage and start to allow the other parts of the heart to get oxygen. And they've done one here as well. They've grafted on an artery in that, or a vein in that case, and reconnected an artery in this case to go around the blockage. That's why it's called a bypass surgery. They're going around the blockage. All right. Any questions about anything so far?